He rode into our valley in the summer of '89. I was a kid then, barely topping the backboard of Father's old chuck wagon. I was on the upper rail of our small corral, soaking in the late afternoon sun, when I saw him far down the road where it swung into the valley from the open plain beyond. In that clear Wyoming air, I could see him plainly, though he was still several miles away. There seemed nothing remarkable about him, just another stray horseman riding up the road toward the cluster of frame buildings that was our town. Then I saw a pair of cowhands loping past him, stop and stare after him with a curious intentness. He came steadily on, straight through the town without slackening pace, until he reached the fork a half-mile below our place. One branch turned left across the river ford and on to Luke Fletcher's big spread. The other bore ahead along the right bank, where we homesteaders had pegged our claims in a row up the valley. He hesitated briefly, studying the choice, and moved again steadily on our side. As he came near, what impressed me first was his clothes. He wore dark trousers of some serge material tucked into tall boots and held at the waist by a wide belt, both of a soft black leather, tooled in intricate design. His shirt was fine-spun linen, rich brown in color. The handkerchief, knotted loosely round his throat, was black silk. His hat was a plain black, soft in texture, unlike any hat I had ever seen, with a creased crown and a wide curling brim swept down in front to shield the face. Then I forgot the clothes in the impact of the man himself. He was clean-shaven, and his face was lean and hard and burned from high forehead to firm, tapering chin. His eyes seemed hooded in the shadow of the hat's brim. He came closer, and I could see that this was because the brows were drawn in a frown of fixed and habitual alertness. Beneath them, the eyes were endlessly searching from side to side and forward, checking off every item in view, missing nothing. As I noticed this, a sudden chill, I could not have told why, struck through me in the warm and open sun. He rode easily, relaxed in the saddle, and he drew rein not 20 feet from me. His glance hit me, dismissed me, flicked over our place. This was not much, if you were thinking in terms of size and scope, but what there was good. The house itself was 3 rooms, 2 really, the big kitchen where we spent most of our time indoors, and the bedroom beside it. My little lean-to room was added back of the kitchen, and we had a nice porch across the front. The house was painted, too, white with green trim, to remind her, Mother said when she made Father do it, of her native New England. The stranger took it all in, sitting there easily in the saddle. I saw his eyes slow on the flowers Mother had planted by the porch steps, then come to rest on our shiny new pump and the trough beside it. I felt that sudden chill, but his voice was gentle, and he spoke like a man schooled to patience. "I'd appreciate a chance of the pump for myself and the horse." Father had come up behind me and was leaning against the gate to the corral. "Use all the water you want, stranger," he said. Father and I watched him dismount and lead the horse over to the trough. He let the horse sink its nose in the cool water before he picked up the dipper for himself. He took off his hat and slapped the dust out of it and hung it on a corner of the trough. With his hands he brushed the dust from his clothes and carefully wiped his boots. He untied the handkerchief from around his neck, rolled up his sleeves, and dipped his arms in the trough, rubbing thoroughly and splashing water over his face. He shook his hands dry, and, taking a comb from his shirt pocket, he smoothed back his long, dark hair. Then he spun about and strode directly toward the house. He bent low and snapped the stem of one of Mother's petunias, and tucked this into his hat band. In another moment the hat was on his head, and he was swinging gracefully into the saddle and starting toward the road. I was fascinated. None of the men I knew were proud like that about their appearance. In that short time, the kind of magnificence I had earlier noticed about him had emerged into plainer view. "Thank you," he said in his gentle voice, and was turning into the road before Father spoke in his slow, deliberate way. "Don't be in such a hurry, stranger." At the first sound of Father's voice, the man and horse like a single being had wheeled to face us, the man's eyes boring at Father. I was shivering, struck through once more. I stared in wonder as Father and the stranger looked at each other a long moment, measuring each other. Then Father was smiling. "I said, don't be in such a hurry, stranger. Food'll be on the table soon. You can bed down here tonight." The stranger nodded quietly. "That's mighty thoughtful of you," he said, and swung down and came toward us, leading his horse. Father slipped into step beside him, and we all headed for the barn. "My name's Starrett," said Father. "Joe Starrett. This here's my son, Bob." The stranger nodded again. "Call me Shane," he said. Then to me, "Bob it is. You were watching me for quite a spell coming up the road." It was a simple statement. "Yes," I stammered. "Yes, I was." "Right," he said. "I like that. A man who watches what's going on around him will make his mark." This Shane knew what would please the boy. In the barn, I fussed around, hanging up his saddle, forking over some hay, getting in his way and my own in my eagerness. Only once did he stop me. That was when I reached for his saddle roll to put it to one side. In the instant my fingers touched it, he was taking it from me and put it on a shelf with a finality that indicated no interference. When the three of us went up to the house, Mother was waiting, and 4 places were set at the table. "I saw you through the window," she said, and came to shake our visitor's hand. She was a slender, lively woman with a fair complexion even our weather never seemed to affect. "Marion," Father said, "I'd like you to meet Mr. Shane." "Good evening, ma'am," said our visitor. He took her hand and bowed over it. Mother stepped back and, to my surprise, dropped in a dainty curtsy. I'd never seen her do that before. She was an unpredictable woman. Father and I would have painted the house 3 times over, and in rainbow colors to please her. "And a good evening to you, Mr. Shane. If Joe hadn't called you back, I would have done it myself. You'd never find a decent meal up the valley." She was proud of her cooking, was Mother. He sat down to supper, and a good one. Mother's eyes sparkled as our visitor kept pace with Father and me. Then we all leaned back, and while I listened, the talk ran on, almost like old friends around a familiar table. But I could sense that it was following a pattern. Father was trying, with Mother helping, and both of them avoiding direct questions, to get hold of facts about this Shane, and he was dodging at every turn. He was aware of their purpose, and not in the least annoyed by it. He was mild and courteous, but always he put them off with words that gave no real information. He was full of news from towns along his back trail as far as Cheyenne, and even Dodge City, and others beyond I'd never heard of before. But he had no news about himself. His past was fenced as tightly as our pasture. All they could learn was that he was riding through, taking each day as it came, with nothing particular in mind except maybe seeing a part of the country he had not been in before. Afterwards, Mother washed the dishes and I dried, and the 2 men sat on the porch, their voices carrying through the open door. Our visitor was guiding the conversation now, and in no time at all he had Father talking about his own plans. "Yeah, Shane, the boys I used to ride range with don't see it yet, but they will someday. Well, the open range can't last forever. The fence lines are closing in. Running cattle in big lots is good business only for the top ranchers. Now, the thing to do is to pick your spot, Get your own land. Put in enough crops to carry you and make your money play with a small herd. And not all horns and bone, but bred for meat, and fenced in and fed right. I haven't been at it very long, but already I've raised stock that averages 300 pounds more than that long-legged stuff Fletcher runs on the other side of the river, and it's better beef. Sure, Fletcher's outfit sprawls over most of this valley, and it looks big, but he's got range rights on a lot more acres than he has cows. His ways are wasteful, but he can't see that. He thinks we small fellas are nothing but a damn nuisance, and he's worried that more of us will keep coming and settle here than he'll be in a fix. The dishes were done, and I was edging to the door. Mother nailed me, as she usually did, and shunted me off to bed. I must have dozed off, for with a start I realized that Father and Mother were again in the kitchen. By now, I gathered, our visitor was out in the bunk in the barn. "Wasn't it peculiar?" I heard Mother say. "How he wouldn't talk about himself. I never saw a man quite like him before." "You wouldn't have," said Father. "Not where you come from. He's a special brand we sometimes get out here in the grass country. I've come across a few. A bad one's poison. A good one's straight grain, clear through." "I like him." Mother's voice was serious. "He's so nice and polite and sort of gentle. Not like most men I've met out here. But there's something underneath the gentleness. Something dangerous." "He's dangerous, all right," Father said in a musing way. Then he chuckled. "But not to us, my dear. In fact, I don't think you ever had a safer man in your house." In the morning, I slept late and stumbled into the kitchen to find Father and our visitor working their way through piles of Mother's flapjacks. Shane nodded to me. "Good morning, Bob. You better dig in fast, or I'll do away with your share, too. There's magic in your mother's cooking. Eat enough of these flannel cakes, you'll grow a bigger man than your father." "Flannel cakes? Did you hear that, Joe?" said Mother. "You must be from Tennessee or some such place. I never heard them call that out here." Our visitor looked up at her. "Good guess, ma'am. Mighty close to the mark. My folks came out of Mississippi, settled in Arkansas. Me, though, I left home at 15. Haven't had anything worth being called a real flannel cake since." He leaned back and smiled. "That is, ma'am, till now." Mother gave what in a girl I would have called a giggle. Before I had even begun on my second plate of flapjacks, the wind was rushing down the valley with the rain of one of our sudden summer storms following fast. "You'll not be traveling in this weather," said Mother. "Wait a bit and it'll clear. These rains don't last long. I've another pot of coffee on the stove." Father was getting his pipe going. "Marion's right. These rains are short, but they sure mess up the roads. Won't be fit for traveling till it drains. You better stay over till tomorrow." Our visitor stared down at his empty plate as if it was the most important object in the whole room. You could see that he liked the idea, yet he seemed somehow worried about it. "You'd be doing us a favor, Mr. Shane," continued Mother. "We don't get many visitors from outside the valley. And besides—" She crinkled her nose at him the way she did when she would be teasing Father into some new scheme of hers. "And besides, I've been waiting for an excuse to try a deep-dish apple pie I've heard tell of. And another thing, I'm fair bubbling with questions about what the women are wearing back in civilization. You know, hats and such. You're the kind of man who would notice them. You're not getting away until you've told me." Shane sat back in his chair. A faint quizzical expression softened the lean ridges of his face. "Ma'am, I'm not positive I appreciate how you've pegged me. No one else ever wrote me down as an expert on ladies' millinery." He reached out and pushed his cup across the table toward her. "You said something about more coffee?" I thought that business about hats was only a joke Mother made up to help Father persuade our visitor to stay. But she began almost at once, pestering him to describe the ladies he'd seen in Cheyenne and other towns. He sat there, easy and friendly, telling her how they were wearing wide, floppy-brimmed bonnets with lots of flowers in front. Talk like that seemed foolish to me to be coming from a grown man, yet this Shane was not bothered at all. The rain outside seemed a far distance away and meaningless, because the friendly feeling in our kitchen was enough to warm all the world. When the sky finally cleared, Father jumped up and fairly shouted, "Come on, Shane, I'll show you what this hopscotch climate does to my alfalfa." We covered the whole place pretty thoroughly, Father talking all the time, more enthusiastic about his plans than he had been for many weeks. He really hit his stride when we were behind the barn, where we could have a good view of our little herd spreading out through the pasture. Then we came to the stump. This was the one bad spot in our place. It stuck out like an old scarred sore in the clean space back of the barn, the legacy of some great tree that must have died long before we came into the valley and finally been snapped by a heavy windstorm. The huge old roots humped out in every direction. Father had been working it on and off, gnawing at the roots with an axe. The going was slow, even for him. The wood was so hard that he could not sink the blade much more than a quarter-inch at a time. He went over to the stump now and kicked the nearest root. "You know, Shane, I've been feuding with this thing for so long I've worked up a spot of affection for it. It's tough. I can admire toughness, the right kind." He was running on again, full of words, when he noticed that Shane was not paying much attention. He was listening to some sound in the distance. Sure enough, a horse and wagon was coming up the road. Shane's attention was on the wagon, and he was tense and alert, studying the man upright on the swaying seat. Then he glanced at Father. "Road not fit for traveling. Stare it. Your poor shakes is a liar." Father simply chuckled at Shane's remark. "That's Jake Ledyard's outfit," he said, starting towards the lane. "I hope he has that cultivator I've been wanting." Ledyard was a trader who came through every couple of months with things you could not get at the general store in town. He would make deliveries in his buckboard, claiming a hard bargain always, and picking up orders for articles to bring on the next trip. Father went to meet him. Shane stayed by the porch, leaning against the end posts. "It's here," said Ledyard. "The beauty I told you about." He yanked away the canvas covering from the wagon, and there was a shiny new 7-pronged cultivator lying on its side. "That's the best buy I've had this haul." Said Father. "That's what I've been wanting. But when you start chattering about a best buy, that always means big money. What's the tariff?" "Well, now," Ledyard was slow with his reply. "Cost me more than I figured when we were talking last time. But you'll make up the difference with the work you'll save with that. Handles so easy, even the boy here will be using it before long." "Pin it down," said Father. "I've asked you a question." "Tell you what, I'll take a loss to please a good customer. I'll let you have it for 110. I was startled to hear Shane's voice cutting in, quiet and even. "Let you have it? I reckon he will. There was one like that in a store in Cheyenne. List price $60. For the first time, Ledyard looked closely at our visitor. The surface smile left his face. He turned to Father, speaking rapidly. "Forget what he says, Starrett. I've heard of him half a dozen times up the road here. No one knows him. No one can figure him. I think I can. Just a stray wandering through, probably chased out of some town and hunting cover. I'm surprised you let him hang around." "You might be surprised at a lot of things," said Father, beginning to bite off his words. "Now give it to me straight on the price." "I'll shave it to 100 if that'll make you feel any better." Ledyard hesitated, watching Father. "He's mixed up. He must have seen one of them flimsy makes, half this size." Father did not say anything. He was looking at Ledyard in a steady, unwavering way. "Starrett, are you going to stand there and let that tramp nobody knows call me a liar? Are you going to take his word over mine? Now look at him. Look at his clothes. He's just a cheap tin horn. Ledyard stopped, choking on whatever it was he meant to say. He fell back a step with sudden fear showing on his face. Shane was no longer leaning against the porch post. He was standing erect, his hands clenched, his eyes boring at Ledyard. That same chill I had felt the day before, intangible and terrifying, was in the air again. Father spoke slowly. Yes, Ledyard, I'm taking his word. He's my guest. But that's not the reason. His head went up. I can figure men for myself. I'll take his word on anything he wants to say any day of God's whole year. Father's voice was flat and final. 60 is the price. Add 10 for a fair profit, even though you probably got it wholesale. Another 10 for hauling it here. That tallies to 80. Take that or leave that. Whatever you do, snap to it and get off my land. Ledyard stared down at his hands. Where's your money? He said. Father went into the house and came back with the crumpled bills. Ledyard helped Father heave the cultivator to the ground, then jumped on the wagon seat and drove off like he was glad to get away from our place. Father and I turned from watching him, and Shane was not in sight. Father shook his head in wonderment. Now, where do you suppose, he was saying, when we saw Shane coming out of the barn. He was carrying an axe, the one Father used for heavy kindling. He went directly around the corner of the building. We stared after him, and we were still staring when we heard it, the clear, ringing sound of steel biting into wood. Father was starting toward the barn with strides so long that I had to run to stay close behind him. We went around the far corner, and there was Shane, squared away at the biggest uncut root of that old stump. He was swinging the axe in steady rhythm. Now, looky here, Father began. There's no call for you. Shane broke his rhythm just long enough to level a straight look at us. Man has to pay his debts, he said, and was again swinging the axe. But you don't owe us anything, I said. Lots of times we have folks in for meals, and Father's hand was on my shoulder. No, Bob, he doesn't mean meals. Father was smiling, and I would have sworn that his eyes were misty. Father watched Shane, and I watched the two of them, until finally the axe sliced through the last strip, and the root was cut. I was sure he would stop, but he stepped right around to the next root and squared away again, and the blade sank in once more. With that, Father began to fidget. Finally, he gave the nearest root a kick and hurried away. In a moment, he was back with the other axe, the big double-bladed one that I could hardly heft from the ground. He picked a root on the opposite side from Shane. He was not angry the way he usually was when he confronted one of those roots, but he whirled that big axe as if it was only a kid's tool. Shane straightened on his side, and their eyes met over the top of the stump and held. Neither of them said a word. Then they swung up their axes, and both of them said plenty to that old stump. A few minutes later, Father smashed through his root with a blow that sent the axe head into the ground beneath. He wrestled with the handle to yank the head loose, and he too tackled another root without even waiting to wipe off the dirt. This began to look like a long session, so I started to wander away. I slipped off to see how Mother's garden was doing after the rain, and maybe add to the population in the box of worms I was collecting for when I would go fishing. But no matter where I went, always I could hear that chopping in the distance. Then, just as I headed around the corner of the barn, Mother came past the corner. She was the freshest, prettiest thing I had ever seen. She'd taken her hat and stripped the old ribbon from it and fixed it as Shane had told her. Some of the small flowers by the house were in a small bouquet in front. She was stepping along daintily, mighty proud of herself. She went up close to the stump, and those two choppers were so busy and intent that they did not really notice her. "Well," she said, "aren't you going to look at me?" They both stopped, and they both stared at her. "Have I got it right?" she asked Shane. "Is this the way their hats are?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "About like that, only their brims are wider." And he swung back to his root. "Joe Starrett, aren't you at least going to tell me whether you like me in this hat?" "Looky here, Marion. You know damn well that whether you have a hat on or whether you don't have a hat on, you're the nicest thing to me that's ever happened on God's green earth. Now, stop bothering us. Can't you see we're busy?" And he swung back to his root. Mother's face was a deep pink. She pulled the hat from her head. Her hair was mussed, and she was really mad. She flounced around and went straight back to the house. I tried to keep myself busy down by the river, skipping flat stones across the current, all muddy still from the rain. I was able to for a while, but that steady chopping had a peculiar fascination. It was always pulling me toward the barn. I was wavering in front of the barn when I suddenly noticed that the chopping was different. Only one axe was working. I hurried around back. Shane was still swinging, cutting into the last root. Father put his shoulder to the stump. He heaved against it. Sweat started to pour down his face. All of a sudden, I was so excited, I wanted to dash to that stump and push it and feel it move. Only I knew that Father would think I was in the way. I ran to the house fast as I could. "Hurry!" I yelled to Mother. "You've got to see it! They're getting it out!" She was as excited as I was and was running right with me. Shane had finished his root and come to help Father. Together they heaved against the stump. It angled up nearly a whole inch, but as soon as they released the pressure, it fell back. Father peered underneath as best he could. "Must be a taproot," he said. This was the one time either of them had spoken to the other, as far as I knew, the whole afternoon through. Shane said nothing. He just picked up his axe and looked at Father and waited. There was some unspoken thought between them. "Joe," Mother called, "why don't you use some sense? Hitch up the team. Horses will have it out in no time at all." Father turned his head to look at her. "Horses?" he shouted. All the pent silence of the two of them that long afternoon through was being shattered in that wonderful shout. "Horses? Great jumping Jehoshaphat, no! We started this with manpower, and by Godfrey, we'll finish it with manpower." Father backed in between the two cut roots and wrapped his hands round two root ends. Slowly he began to straighten. Slowly that huge old stump began to rise. Up it came, inch by inch. Shane stooped to peer under. He poked his axe into the opening, and I heard it strike wood. He flashed one quick glance at Father, eyes closed, muscles locked in that great sustained effort, and he extended his left leg and thigh into the opening so that the whole terrible weight of the stump poised above nearly half of his body, and he sent the axe sweeping under it in swift, powerful strokes. Suddenly, Father seemed to slip. Only he had not slipped. He had straightened even further. Shane jumped out and grabbed one of the root ends to help Father. Both men were aflame with a concentrated, cold fire. Shane's side of the stump rocked forward even with Father's, and finally the whole mass of the stump tore loose and toppled away to sprawl in ungainly defeat before them. Father walked to the stump and patted it like it was an old friend, and he was perhaps a little sorry for it. Shane was with him, across from him, laying a hand gently on the old hard wood. They both looked up, and their eyes met and held. I thought they should at least say something to each other. They stood quiet and motionless. At last Father turned and came toward Mother. He was so tired that the weariness showed in his walk. Shane, too, was coming toward us. He spoke to Mother. "Ma'am, I've learned something today. Being a farmer has more to it than I ever thought. Now I'm about ready for some of that pie." Mother had been watching them in wide-eyed wonder. At his last words, she let out a positive wail.
"Oh, you men! You made me forget about it. It's probably all burned."
And she was running for the house so fast she was tripping over her skirt. The pie was burned all right. We could smell it when we came round to the front of the house. And the noises from inside sounded as if Mother might be throwing things round. Kettles were banging and dishes were clattering. When we went in, she would not look at one of us. We sat down to supper and waited for her to join us, but she whirled and glared at Father. Her voice was sharp.
"I was planning to have a deep-dish apple pie. Well, I will. None of your silly man foolishness is going to stop me."
With that, she went to the apple barrel and filled her wooden bowl with fat, round ones. She sat down by the stove and started peeling them. Father pulled out his old jackknife and moved over to her, stepping softly. He reached out for an apple to help her, but her voice caught him like she had flicked him with a whip.
"Joe Starrett, don't you dare touch a one of those apples."
He was sheepish as he returned to his chair. Then he was downright mad. He grabbed his knife and fork and dug into the food on his plate, taking big bites and chewing vigorously. There was nothing for our visitor and me to do but follow his example. When we finished, Mother was still sitting by the stove, arms folded, staring at the wall, waiting for her pie to bake. When it was done, she lifted it out, cut 4 wide pieces, and put them on the table. "I'm sorry I kept you men waiting so long. Your pie's ready now." Father inspected his portion like he was afraid of it. Shane raised a piece on his fork. He considered it closely. He put it in his mouth and chewed on it gravely. "Yes," he said, with a quizzical expression on his face. "Yes, that's the best bit of stump I ever tasted." Then Father chuckled and chuckled until he was swaying in his chair. "My Godfrey, Marion, he's right. You've done it, too." Mother stared from one to the other of them. Her pinched look faded, and her eyes were soft and warm, and she was laughing so that the tears came. And all of us were pitching into that pie. And the one thing wrong in the whole world was that there wasn't enough of it. The sun was already well up in the sky when I awakened the next morning. I'd been a long time getting to sleep the night before, because my mind was full of the day's excitement and shifting moods. I had lain in my bed thinking of our visitor out in the bunk in the barn. It scarce seemed possible that he was the same man I had first seen, stern and chilling in his dark solitude, riding up our road. Something in Father had reached out and spoken to him, and he had replied to it, and had unlocked a part of himself to us. I'd been thinking, too, of the effect he had on Father and Mother. They were more alive, more vibrant when they were with him. I could appreciate that because I felt the same way myself. I realized with a jolt how late it was. I pulled on my clothes and ran to the kitchen. "My heavens," said Mother as I burst out of my room. "You came in here like something was after you. What's the matter?" "I just thought," I blurted out, nodding at Shane, "that maybe he'd ridden off and forgotten me." Shane shook his head slightly, looking straight at me. "I wouldn't forget you, Bob. And I wouldn't forget your cooking, ma'am," he said, turning to Mother. "You begin having a special lot of people passing by at meal times. That'll be because a grateful man has been boasting of your flannel cakes all along the road." "Oh, there's an idea," stuck in Father, as if he was glad to find something safe to talk about. "We'll turn this place into a boarding house. Marion'll fill folks full of her meals, and I'll fill my pockets full of their money. That hits me as a mighty convenient arrangement." Mother sniffed at him. But she was pleased at their talk, and she was smiling as they kept on playing with the idea while she stirred up my breakfast. They were enjoying themselves, and it was remarkable how natural it was to have this Shane sitting there joining in like he was a member of the family. Shane stood up at last, and I knew he was going to ride away from us, and I wanted desperately to stop him. Father did it for me. He looked directly at Shane. "Are you running away from anything?" Shane stared at the plate in front of him for a long moment. "No, I'm not running away from anything. Not in the way you mean." "Good. Look, Shane, I'm not a rancher, you know that. I'm a farmer. Something of a stockman, maybe, but really a farmer. Now, that's what I want to be, and I'm proud of it. I've made a fair start. This outfit isn't as big as I hope to have it someday, but there's more work here already than one man can handle if it's to be done right. The young fellow I had ran out on me after he tangled with a couple of Fletcher's boys in town one day." Shane looked out the window over the valley to the mountains. "It's always the same," he murmured, as if talking to himself. "The old ways die hard." Then he looked at Mother and at me, and his eyes came back to Father. "So Fletcher's crowding you," he said gently. "I don't crowd easy, but I've a job to do here, and it's too big for one man, even for me. Will you stick here a while and help me get things in shape for the winter?" Shane rose to his feet. "I never figured to be a farmer, Starrett. All the same, you've hired yourself a hand." He and Father were looking at each other in a way that showed they were saying things words could never cover. Shane snapped it by swinging towards Mother. "And I'll rate your cooking, ma'am, wages enough." Father slapped his hands on his knees. "You'll get good wages, and you'll earn 'em. First off, why don't you drop into town and get some work clothes? Try Sam Grafton's store. Tell him to put it on my bill." Shane was already at the door. "I'll buy my own," he said, and was gone. Father was so pleased, he jumped up and whirled Mother around. "Marion, the sun's shining mighty bright at last. We got ourselves a man."
"But, Joe, are you sure you know what you're doing? He said himself he doesn't know anything about farming."
"Neither did I when I started here. What a man knows isn't important. It's what he is that counts. Nobody'll push him around or scare him away. He's my kind of man." It was not 3 days before you saw that Shane could stay right beside Father in any kind of work. For all his slim build, he was plenty rugged. What he lacked alongside Father in size and strength, he made up in quickness of movement, in instinctive coordination of mind and muscle, and in that sudden, fierce energy that burned in him. He never shirked at the meanest task. He was ever ready to take the hard end of any chore. But there were things about Shane I could not understand. When he came in to the first meal after he agreed to stay on with us, he went to the chair that had always been Father's and stood beside it, waiting for the rest of us to take the other places. Mother was surprised and somewhat annoyed, but Father quieted her with a warning glance. He walked to the chair across from Shane and sat down like this was the right and natural spot for him. I could not see any reason for the shift until the first time one of our homestead neighbors knocked on the door while we were eating, and came straight on in, as most of them usually did. Then I suddenly realized that Shane was sitting opposite the door, where he could directly confront anyone coming through it. But I could not understand why he wanted it that way. In the evenings after supper, when he was talking lazily with us, he would never sit by the window. Out on the porch, he would always face the road, with his back to the nearest wall. This alertness could be noted, too, in the watch he kept on every approach to our place. He knew first when anyone was moving along the road, and he would stop whatever he was doing to study carefully any passing rider. What puzzled me most, though, was something it took me nearly 2 weeks to appreciate, and yet it was the most striking thing of all. Shane carried no gun. In those days, guns were as familiar all through the territory as boots and saddles. Most men did not feel fully dressed without one, We homesteaders went in mostly for rifles and shotguns, as a pistol slapping on the hip was a nuisance for a farmer. Still, every man had his cartridge belt and holstered Colt to be worn when he was not working. But this Shane never carried a gun. And that was a peculiar thing, because he had a gun. I saw it once. I saw it when I was alone in the barn one day, and I spotted his saddle roll lying on his bunk. Usually he kept it carefully put away underneath. He must have forgotten it this time, for it was there in the open by the pillow. I reached to sort of feel it, and I felt the gun inside. No one was near, so I unrolled the blankets. There it was, the most beautiful-looking weapon I ever saw. Beautiful and deadly-looking. Why should a man with a gun like that refuse to wear it and show it off? And then, staring at that dark and deadly efficiency, I was again suddenly chilled, and I quickly put everything back exactly as before and hurried out into the sun. First chance I had, I tried to tell Father about it. "Father," I said, all excited, "do you know what Shane has rolled up in his blankets?" "Probably a gun." But how did you know? Have you seen it?" "No, that's what he would have." I was all mixed up. "Well, why doesn't he ever carry it? Do you suppose maybe it's because he doesn't know how to use it very well?" Father chuckled like I had made a joke. "Son, I wouldn't be surprised if he could take that gun and shoot the buttons off your shirt with you a-wearing it, and all you'd feel would be a breeze." "Gosh, why does he keep it hidden in the barn then?" "I don't know. Not exactly." "Why don't you ask him?" Father looked straight at me, very serious. "That's one question I'll never ask him. And don't you ever say anything to him about it. There are some things you don't ask a man, not if you respect him." That was that. But I was still mixed up. Soon, it did not seem possible that there had ever been a time when Shane was not with us. He and Father worked together more like partners than boss and hired man. The amount they could get through in a day was a marvel. The ditching Father had reckoned would take him most of the summer was done in less than a month. The loft was finished, and the first cutting of alfalfa stowed away. We had enough fodder to carry a few more young steers, so Father left the valley to get some. He was gone 2 days. He came back to find that Shane had knocked out the end of the corral and posted a new section, making it half again as big. "Now we can really get going next year," Shane said, as Father sat on his horse, staring at the corral like he could not quite believe what he saw. "We ought to get enough hay off that new field to help us carry 40 head." "Uh-huh. We ought to get enough hay." Father was pleased as could be, because he was scowling at Shane the same way he did at me when he was tickled by something but didn't want to let on that he was. He jumped off his horse and hurried up to Mother, who was standing on the porch. "Marion," he demanded, right off, waving at the corral, "whose idea was that?" "Well, Shane suggested it." Then she added slyly, "But I told him to go ahead." "That's right." Shane had come up beside him. "She rode me like she had spurs on to get it done by today. Kind of present. It's your wedding anniversary." "Well, I'll be damned," said Father. "So it is." He stared foolishly at one and then the other of them. With Shane there watching, he hopped on the porch and gave Mother a kiss. I was embarrassed and turned away. "Hey, those steers are running away!" The grown folks had forgotten about them. All 6 were wandering up the road, straggling and separating. Shane let out a whoop you might have heard halfway to town and ran to Father's horse, vaulting into the saddle. He fairly lifted the horse into a gallop in one leap, and that old cow-pony of Father's lit out after those steers like this was fun. By the time Father reached the corral gate, Shane had the runaways in a compact bunch and padding back at a trot. He was perky and proud. "It's been 10 years since I did anything like that." Father grinned at him. "Shane, if I didn't know you better, I'd say you were a faker. There's still a lot of kid in you." The first real smile I had seen yet flashed across Shane's face. Maybe there is that. I think that was the happiest summer of my life. Even the recurrent trouble between Fletcher and us homesteaders seemed to have faded away. Fletcher himself was gone most of the summer. He'd gone to Fort Bennett in Dakota to get a contract to supply beef to the big Sioux reservation over beyond the Black Hills. Now, with him away, his men kept to the other side of the river and didn't bother us. Until Shane came, these men had been my heroes. Father, of course, was special all to himself, but I wanted, as Father had done, to ride the range, to have my own string of ponies, and take part in an all-brand roundup, and in a big cattle drive. Now I was not so sure. I wanted more and more to be like Shane, like the man I imagined he was in the past, fenced off so securely. I had to imagine most of it, for he would never speak of it. It was plain, though, that Shane was beginning to enjoy living with us and working the place. Little by little, the tension in him was fading out. He was still watchful, but the sharp edge of alertness, almost of expectancy of some trouble, was wearing away. Yet, why was he sometimes so strange and stricken in his own bitterness? Like the time I was playing with an old Colt pistol with a cracked barrel. I was stalking around near the barn, whirling every few steps to pick off a skulking Injun, when I saw Shane watching me from the barn door. I stopped short, thinking he would make fun of me and my sorry old broken pistol. But he didn't. "How many you knocked over so far, Bob?" "That makes 7. "Injuns or timber wolves?" "Injuns. Big ones." "Better leave a few for the other scouts," he said gently. "And look here, Bob, you're not doing that quite right." He sat down on an upturned crate and beckoned me over. "Your holster's too low. Don't let it drag full arm's length. Have it just below the hip, so the grip is about halfway between your wrist and elbow when the arm's hanging limp. You can take the gun then as your hand's coming up. There's still room to clear the holster without having to lift the gun too high." "Gosh, is that the way real gunfighters do?" A queer light flickered in his eyes and was gone. "No, not all of them. Most have their own tricks. The way I'm telling you is as good as any, and better than most. And another thing." He hefted the old gun, letting it lie loosely in his hand. While I gaped at him, he tossed it swiftly in the air, spinning it end over end. As it came down, the forefinger slipped through the trigger guard, and the gun spun, coming up into firing position in one unbroken motion. With him, that old pistol seemed alive. "If it's speed you're after, Bob, don't split the mule into parts. Don't pull, cock, aim, and fire. Slip back the hammer as you bring the gun up, and squeeze the trigger the second it's up level." "How do you aim it, then?" "No need to. Just point it low and quick and easy, like pointing a finger." Like pointing a finger. As the words came, he was doing it. Then, suddenly, the hand around the gun whitened, and the finger slowly opened, and the gun fell to the ground. The hand sank to his side, stiff and awkward. His eyes were fastened on the mountains climbing in the distance. "Shane? Shane, what's the matter?" He didn't hear me. He was back somewhere along the dark trail of the past. He took a deep breath, and I could see the effort run through him as he dragged himself into the present, and a realization of a boy staring at him. He beckoned to me to pick up the gun. When I did, he leaned forward and spoke earnestly. "Listen, Bob, the gun is just a tool. No better and no worse than any other tool. A shovel, or an axe, a a saddle, a stove, or anything. Think of it always that way. A gun is as good and as bad as the man who carries it. Remember that." He stood up and strode off into the fields, and I knew he wanted to be alone. The season of friendship in our valley was fading with the summer sun's warmth. Fletcher was back, and he had his contract. He was talking in town that he would need the whole range again. We had no intention of leaving. The land was ours by right of settlement, guaranteed by the government. Only we knew, too, how far away the government was from our valley, way up there in the territory. The nearest sheriff or marshal was a good 100 miles away. Our town was small, not even organized as a town. The first people there were 3 or 4 miners who had come prospecting. Then a stage and freighting line had picked the site for a relay post. That meant a place where you could get drinks as well as horses. With us homesteaders coming now, 1 or 2 almost every season, the town was taking shape. Already there were several stores, a blacksmith shop, and nearly a dozen houses. Just the year before, the men had put together a 1-room schoolhouse. Sam Grafton's place was the biggest. He had the general store in one half of his rambling building, and a saloon with a long bar and tables for cards and the like in the other half. Even if we had a sheriff in the town, he would have been Fletcher's man. Fletcher was the power in the valley in those days. We homesteaders had been around only a few years. He had been running cattle through the whole valley at the time the miners arrived. There was a hurried council of the homesteaders in our house as soon as the news of Fletcher's talk was around. Our neighbor toward town, Lou Johnson, who heard it in Grafton's store, spread the word and arrived first. He was followed by Henry Shipstead. These two had been the original homesteaders, solid, dependable, old-line farmers who had come west from Iowa. You could not say as much for the rest, straggling in at intervals. James Lewis and Ed Howells had not done well and could be easily discouraged. Frank Torrey was always talking about pulling up stakes and heading for California, and Ernie Wright was probably the weakest of the lot. He had a quick temper that would trap him into doing fool things without taking thought. He was as serious as the rest of them that night. Mr. Grafton had said that this time Fletcher meant business. "But what can he do?" asked Frank Torrey. "The land's ours, as long as we live on it." "My guess," said Father, "is he'll try putting pressure on us, see if he can wear us down. He'll probably start right here. He doesn't like any of us, but he doesn't like me the most." "That's true." Ed Howells was expressing the unspoken verdict that Father was their leader. "How do you figure he'll go about it?" "My guess is that he'll begin by trying to convince Shane here that it isn't healthy to be working with me." "You mean the way he—" "Yes, I mean the way he did with young Morley." Father was right. In some strange fashion, the feeling was abroad that Shane was a marked man. Attention was on him as a sort of symbol. If Shane could be driven out, there would be a break in the homestead ranks. It could be the crack in the dam that weakens the whole structure and finally lets through the flood. The people in town were more curious than ever, not now so much about Shane's past, as about what he might do if Fletcher tried any move against him. Shane was aware of it. He never missed anything. Yet he went about his work as usual, smiling frequently now at me, bantering Mother at meal times, arguing amiably with Father on plans for next year. The only thing that was different was that there appeared to be a lot of new activity across the river. It was surprising how often Fletcher's cowboys were finding jobs to do within view of our place. Then, one afternoon, when we were stowing away the second and last cutting of hay, one fork of the big tongs we were using to haul it up to the loft broke loose. "Have to get it welded in town," Father said in disgust, and began to hitch up the team. Shane stared over the river, where a cowboy was riding lazily back and forth by a bunch of cattle. "I'll take it in," he said. Father looked at Shane, and he looked across the way, and he grinned. "All right. It's as good a time as any. Just a minute, and I'll be ready." "Take it easy, Joe." Shane's voice was gentle, but it stopped Father in his tracks. "I said, I'll take it in." Father whirled to face him. "Damn it all, man, do you think I'd let you go alone? Well, suppose they—" He bit down on his own words. He wiped a hand slowly across his face. "I'm sorry. I should have known better." Father stood there silently as Shane gathered up the reins and jumped to the wagon seat. I waited till Shane was driving out the lane. I ducked behind the barn, around the end of the corral, and hopped into the wagon as it went past. As I did, I saw a cowboy across the river spin his horse and ride rapidly off in the direction of the ranch house. Shane saw it too, and it seemed to give him grim amusement. He reached backwards and hauled me over the seat and sat me beside him. "You Starretts like to mix into things." For a moment I thought he might send me back. Instead, he grinned at me. We found the welding would take nearly an hour, so I squatted on the steps of the long porch across the front of Grafton's building, while Shane stepped into the saloon side and ordered a drink. It was only a few minutes before two cowboys came galloping down the road and pulled up outside Grafton's. One of them I had seen often, a young fella everyone called Chris, who had worked with Fletcher several years and was known for his gay manner and reckless courage, and the other was new to me. They paid no attention to me. They stepped softly up to the porch and to the window of the saloon. As they peered through, the new man stiffened and leaned closer for a better look. Abruptly he turned clear about and came right down past me and went over to his horse. Chris was startled and hurried after him. The new man was lifting the reins over his horse's head when Chris caught his arm. "What the hell?" "I'm leaving now. For good." "Hey, listen. You know that guy?" "I didn't say that. I'm leaving, that's all. You can tell Fletcher." Chris was getting mad. "I might have known. Scared, eh? Yella?" The man climbed on his horse and swung out from the rail. "You can call it that," he said flatly, and started down the road out of town. Chris was shaking his head in wonderment. "Hell," he said to himself. "I'll brace him myself." He stalked up to the porch and went into the saloon. I dashed into the store side over to the opening between the two big rooms. I crouched on a box just inside the store where I could hear everything and see most of the saloon. Shane was leaning easily with one arm on the bar, his drink in his other hand, when Chris came to perhaps 6 feet away and called for a whiskey bottle and a glass. Then he deliberately looked Shane over, like he'd spotted him for the first time. "Hello, farmer," he said sarcastically. "Speaking to me?" Shane asked mildly, and finished his drink. "Hell, ain't nobody else standing there. Here, have a drink of this." Chris shoved the bottle along the bar. Shane poured himself a generous slug and raised it to his lips. "I'll be damned." Chris slapped his leather chaps with a loud smack. He turned to take in the other men. "You see that? This farmer drinks whiskey. I didn't think these plow-pushing dirt grubbers drank anything stronger than sody pop." "Some of us do," said Shane, friendly as before. Then his voice was like winter frost. "You've had your fun, and it's mighty young fun. Now run home and tell Fletcher to send a grown-up man next time." He turned away and called out to the barman. "Do you have any soda pop? I'd like a bottle." Will Atke, the barman, produced a bottle of the pop Mr. Grafton kept for us school kids. Then Chris began to look elaborately around the room, sniffing loudly. "Hey, Will," he called. "What's been happening in here? It smells. That ain't no clean cattleman smell. That's plain dirty barnyard." He stared at Shane. "You, farmer! What are you and Starrett raising out there? Pigs?" Shane was just taking hold of the bottle Will had fetched him. He moved slowly, almost unwillingly, to face Chris, and there was that fierce concentration in him, filling him, blazing in his eyes. The big room was so quiet the stillness fairly hurt. Chris stepped back involuntarily, then pulled up erect, and still nothing happened. The lean muscles along the side of Shane's jaw were ridged like rock. Then the breath, pent in him, broke the stillness with a soft sound as it left his lungs. He looked away from Chris, and quietly he walked through the doors and was gone. I heard a sigh of relief near me in the room, but Chris swaggered as he went to the doors and peered over them. "You saw it, Will," he called over his shoulder. "He walked out on me." Chris pushed up his hat and rolled back on his heels and laughed. "With a bottle of soda pop, too!" Shane had the soda pop waiting for me at the blacksmith shop. Cherry pop, the kind I favored most. But I could not enjoy it much. Shane was so silent and stern. He had slipped back into the dark mood that was on him when he first came riding up our road. Only once did he speak to me, and I knew he did not expect me to understand or answer. "Life's a dirty business, Bob. Why should a young man be smashed just because he has courage and does what he's told? I could like that boy." And he turned inwards again to his own thoughts. When we reached home, Father popped out the barn door so quick you could tell he was bursting with curiosity. "See any of your cowboy heroes in town, Bob?" Shane answered. "One of Fletch's crew chased us in to pay his respects." "No," I said, proud of my information. "There were two of them. The other one went up on the porch, looked in the window where you were, and came right back down and rode off. He said he was leaving for good." Father and Shane looked at each other. Father was smiling. "One down? You didn't even know it. What did you do to the other?" "Nothing. He passed a few remarks about farmers. I went back to the blacksmith shop." Father switched to me. "Who was it, Bob?" "It was Chris." Father was smiling again. "Young Chris must have been considerable surprised when you walked out. It was too bad the other one didn't stick around." "Yes," Shane said gravely. "It was." The way he said it sobered Father. "I hadn't thought of that. Chris is just cocky enough to take it wrong. That could make things pretty unpleasant." "Yeah," Shane said again. "It can." The story Chris told was common knowledge all through the valley before the sun set the next day, and the story grew in the telling. Fletcher had an advantage now, and he was quick to push it. He and his foreman, Morgan, kept their men primed to rowel us homesteaders at every chance. They took to using the upper ford and riding down the road past our places every time they had an excuse for going to town. They would go by slowly, looking everything over with interest, and passing remarks for our benefit. "Wonder where Starrett keeps the critters. I don't see a pig in sight, but I can smell 'em." With that, they would all begin to laugh and whoop and holler and go tearing off, kicking up a lot of dust. Shane, self-sufficient as the mountains, could ignore it. And Father, while it galled him, could keep it from getting him. The other homesteaders, though, could not help being irritated and showing they felt insulted. Things became so bad they could not go into Grafton's store without someone singing out for soda pop. And the conversation nearby always snuck around somehow to pigs. It roughed their nerves and made them angry and restless. They didn't know Shane as Father and I did. They were not sure there might not be some truth in the big talk Chris was making. The effect showed in the attitude our neighbors now had toward Shane and Father. That was what finally drove Shane. I think he didn't care what anyone thought of him, but he did care what they thought of Father. He was standing silently on the porch the night Ernie Wright and Henry Shipstead were arguing with Father in the kitchen. "You can't dodge it, Joe.
This was right. "Your man's responsible. You can try explaining all night, but you can't change the facts. Chris braced him for a fight, and he ducked out, and left us stuck with those stinking pigs." "You know as well as I do what Fletcher's doing," growled Henry Shipstead. "He's pushing us with this. He won't let up till one of us gets enough and makes a fool play, starts something so he can move in and finish it." Father stopped him with a hand up for silence. "Listen, what's that?" It was a horse, picking up speed and tearing down our lane into the road. Father was at the door in a single jump, peering out. The others were close behind him. "Shane?" Father nodded. "That's Shane. All we can do now is wait." It could not have been much more than 20 minutes before we heard the horse again, coming swiftly. There were quick steps on the porch, and Shane stood in the doorway. His mouth was a thin line in the bleakness of his face, and his eyes were deep and dark. He looked at Shipstead and Wright, and he made no effort to hide the disgust in his voice. "Your pigs are dead and buried. Chris won't be bothering anybody for quite a spell." He turned and disappeared, and we could hear him leading the horse to the barn. In the quiet following, more hoofbeats sounded in the distance. Soon Ed Howells hurried in. He slumped into a chair. He seemed a bit dazed. "I never saw anything like it," he said, and he told about it. He had been in Grafton's store, buying a few things, when he noticed how still the place was. He went over to the saloon opening to sneak a look, and there was Shane just moving to the bar. "2 bottles of soda pop," Shane called to Will Atke. He leaned his back to the bar and looked to where Chris was playing poker with what seemed a friendly interest, while Will fetched the bottles. Not another person even twitched a muscle. They were all watching him and wondering what the play was. He took the 2 bottles and walked to the poker table and set them down, reaching over to put one in front of Chris. "The last time I was in here, you bought me a drink. Now it's my turn." The words sort of lingered in the stillness. You could have heard a bug crawl, I guess, while Chris carefully laid down the cards in his right hand and stretched it to the bottle. He lifted it with a sudden jerk and flung it across the table at Shane. So fast Shane moved, Ed Howells said, that the bottle was still in the air when he had dodged, lunged forward, grabbed Chris by the shirt front, and hauled him right out of his chair and over the table. Chris was mad down to his boots, and he plunged in, fists smashing. Shane ducked under, caught one of the flying fists, twisted the arm to lock it and keep it from bending, and swung his shoulder into the armpit. He yanked hard on the wrist, and Chris went up and over him. As the body hurtled over, Shane kept hold of the arm and wrenched it sideways and let the weight bear on it, and you could hear the bone crack as Chris crashed to the floor. Shane stood motionless, and his eyes shifted to search the faces of the others at the table. They stopped on Red Marlin, and Red seemed to dwindle lower in his chair. "Perhaps," Shane said softly, and the very softness of his voice sent shivers through Ed Howells, "perhaps you have something to say about soda pop or pigs?" Red Marlin sat quiet, like he was trying not even to breathe. He was frightened, maybe for the first time in his life, and the others knew it, and he knew they knew. Then, as they watched, Shane forgot them all and turned toward Chris, unconscious on the floor. And a sort of sadness, Ed Howells said, crept over him. He bent and scooped the sprawling figure up in his arms and carried it to one of the other tables. Gently he set it down. He crossed to the bar and took the rag Will used to wipe it, and returned to the table and tenderly cleared the blood from the face. All this while no one said a word. "You better tote him home and get that arm fixed," said Shane. "Take right good care of him. He has the makings of a good man." Then he forgot them all again and looked at Chris. "There's only one thing really wrong with you. You're young. That's the one thing time can always cure." "The whole business," Ed Howells finished, "didn't take 5 minutes. In my opinion, that Shane is the most dangerous man I've ever seen." After that, Shane was changed. On the surface, nothing was different, but he had lost that serenity that had seeped into him through the summer. He was restless with some far-hidden desperation. More than once, the dishes done, when I managed to slip past Mother, I found him far back in the pasture, alone with his horse. He would be standing there, one arm on the smooth arc of the horse's neck, the fingers gently rubbing round the ears, and he would be looking out over our land where the last light of the sun would be flaring up the far side of the mountains. I was not sure whether Father and Mother were aware of the change in him. They didn't talk about it, not while I was around anyway. But one afternoon, I overheard something that showed Mother knew. I had hurried home from school and had my mind set on the cookies she kept in a tin box on a shelf by the stove. She was settled on the porch with a batch of potatoes to peel, so I slipped up to the back of the house, through the window in my little room, and into the kitchen. Just then I heard her call to Shane. He must have come to the barn on some errand, for he was there by the porch in only a moment. I peeped out the front window and saw him standing there, his hat in his hand. "I've been wanting to talk to you when Joe wasn't around." "Yes, Marion." He called her that the same as Father did, familiar yet respectful, just as he always regarded her with tenderness in his eyes he had for no one else. "You've been worrying, haven't you, about what may happen in this Fletcher business?" "You're a discerning woman, Marion." "You've been worrying about something else, too." "You're a mighty discerning woman, Marion." "And you've been thinking that maybe you'll be moving on?" "And how did you know that?" "Because it's what you ought to do, for your sake. But I'm asking you not to." Mother was intense and serious. "Don't go, Shane. Joe needs you, more than ever now, more than he would ever say." "And you?" "Yes, it's only fair to say it. I need you too."
"So," he said gravely. "Do you know what you're asking, Marion?"
"I know. In some ways it would be easier for me, too, if you rode out of the valley and never came back. But we can't let Joe down. I'm counting on you not ever to make me do that. Because you've got to stay, Shane, no matter how hard it is for us. Joe can't keep this place without you. He can't buck Fletcher alone." Shane was silent. "It would just about kill Joe to lose this place. He's too old to start in again somewhere else. When Bob was big enough to walk, he came here and filed his claim and built this house with his own hands. And when he brought us here, it was home. Nothing else would ever be the same." Shane drew a deep breath and let it ease out slowly. Then he smiled at her. "Joe should be proud of a wife like you. And don't fret any more, Marion. You'll not lose this place." Another period of peace had settled over our valley. Since the night Shane rode into town, Fletcher's cowboys were not annoying us, and only once in a while was there a rider in view across the river. Just the same, I noticed that Father was as watchful as Shane now. The two of them worked always together. They did not split any more to do separate jobs in different parts of the farm, and Father took to wearing his gun all the time, even in the fields. He strapped it on after breakfast the first morning following the fight with Chris, and I saw him catch Shane's eye with a questioning glance as he buckled the belt. But Shane shook his head, and Father nodded, accepting the decision, and they went out together without saying a word. Saturday evenings, all of us would pile into the wagon and go into town. It was a break in the routine we looked forward to all week. There was always a bustle in Grafton's store, with people we knew coming and going. Mother would lay in her supplies for the week ahead, and Father would settle on a barrel and spread out his newspaper. But, like as not, he would soon be bogged down in an argument with almost any man handy about the best crops for the territory, and it would be Shane who would really work his way through the newspaper. I used to explore the store, filling myself with crackers from the open barrel at the end of the main counter, playing hide-and-seek with Mr. Grafton's big and knowing old cat that was a whiz of a mouser. Many a time, turning up boxes, I chased out a fat, furry one for her to pounce on. If Mother was in the right mood, I would have a bag of candy in my pocket. This time we had a special reason for staying longer than usual. Our schoolteacher had asked Mother to stop in for a talk about me. For twice that week, I had persuaded Ollie Johnson to sneak away with me after the lunch hour to go fishing. Mother finished the last item on her list and went over to where Father was leafing through a catalog and tapped him. "Come along, Joe. You should hear this, too. I declare that boy is getting too big for me to handle." Father glanced quickly over the store and paused, listening to the voices from the next room. We had not seen any of Fletcher's men all evening, and he seemed satisfied. He looked at Shane, who was folding the newspaper. "Now, this won't take long. We'll be out in a moment." As they passed through the door at the rear of the store, Shane strolled to the saloon opening. He took in the whole room in his easy, alert way and stepped inside. I was supposed not ever to go in there, so I stopped at the entrance. Shane was at the bar, joshing Will Atke with a grave face that he didn't think he'd have soda pop tonight. I was letting my eyes wander about when I saw that one of the swinging doors was partly open, and Red Marlin was peeking in. Shane saw it too, but he could not see that more men were on the porch, for they were close by the building wall and on the store side. I scrambled into the saloon and to Shane, and I gasped, "Shane, there's a lot of them out front." I was too late. Red Marlin was inside, and the others were hurrying in and fanning out to close off the store opening. Morgan was one of them. Shane's face was clear, his eyes bright. He was somehow happy, not in the pleased and laughing way, but happy that the waiting was over. He put one hand on my head and rocked it gently, the fingers feeling through my hair. "Get out of here, Bob. This isn't going to be pretty." Love for that man raced through me, and the warmth ran down and stiffened my shaking legs, and I was so proud of being there with him that I could not keep the tears from my eyes. I went, but I would go no further than my perch just inside the store, where I could watch most of the big room. Morgan was in the lead now, with his men spread out behind him. The room was quiet, except for the shuffling of feet as the men by the bar and the nearest tables hastened over to the far wall. Morgan was little more than an arm's length from Shane. "No one messes up one of my boys and gets away with it. We're riding you out of this valley on a rail, Shane." "So you have it all planned," Shane said softly. Even as he was speaking, he was moving. He flowed into action so swift you could hardly believe what was happening. He scooped up his half-filled glass from the bar, whipped it and its contents into Morgan's face, and when Morgan's hands came up reaching for him, he grasped the wrists and sent him flying on and over to fall in a tangle of chairs. The other four were on Shane in a rush. As they came, he whirled, tipping the nearest table. They scattered, dodging, and he stepped fast and light around the end and drove into the man nearest to him. I saw his knee surge up and into the man's groin. A high scream was literally torn from the man, and he collapsed. Morgan was on his feet, wavering. The other three were battering at Shane, seeking to box him in between them. They were piling blows into him, crowding in. Through the blur of movement, he was weaving, quick and confident. It was incredible, but they could not hurt him. He moved like a flame among them. Then Red Marlin came at him from one side, forcing him to turn that way. And at the same time, the second man did a strange thing. He jumped high in the air like a jackrabbit and lashed out with one boot at Shane's head. Shane saw it coming but could not avoid it, so he rolled his head with a kick. It shook him badly, but his hands shot up and seized the foot, and the man crashed down to land on the small of his back. As he hit, Shane twisted the whole leg and threw his weight on it. The man buckled, the fight gone from him. But the movement put Shane's back to Red Marlin. Red's arms clamped around him, pinning his arms to his body. Another man leaped to help, and the two of them had Shane caught tight between them. "Hold him!" That was Morgan, coming forward with the hate plain in his eyes. He swept a bottle off the bar and brought it smashing down on Shane's head. Then he deliberately flung a huge fist to Shane's face. Shane tried to jerk aside, and the fist missed the jaw, tearing along the cheek, the heavy ring on one finger slicing deep. Morgan pulled back for another blow. He never made it. Father was there in the doorway. He was on them before they even knew he was in the room. He hurtled into Morgan with ruthless force, sending that huge man reeling across the room. Shane must have exploded into action the second Father yanked Morgan away, for now there was another sound. It was Red Marlin, his face contorted, flung across the bar. He staggered and caught his balance and ran for the front doorway. His flight was frantic. Father was starting again towards Morgan. "Wait, Joe. That man's mine." Shane was at Father's side, and he put a hand on Father's arm. "You better get them out of here." He nodded in my direction, and I noticed with surprise that Mother was near and watching. Father was disappointed, but he went no further. He came to us and looked down at Mother. "You wait in the wagon, Marion. It's not for a woman to see." Mother shook her head without moving her eyes from Shane. "No, Joe. He's one of us. I'll see this through." Shane advanced toward Morgan. He had forgotten us. His whole being was concentrated on the big man before him. Morgan was taller, half again as broad, with a long reputation as a bullying fighter in the valley. He knew better than to wait. He rushed at Shane to overwhelm the smaller man with his weight. Shane faded from in front of him, and as Morgan went past, he hooked a sharp blow to his stomach. Morgan rushed again and again, driving his big fists ahead. Always Shane slipped away, sending in those swift, hard punches. Then Morgan bellowed and swung up a chair. Holding it in front of him, legs forward, he rushed again at Shane, who sidestepped neatly. Morgan was expecting this, and swung the chair in a swift arc to strike Shane with it full on the side. The chair shattered, and Shane faltered, and then he seemed to slip and fall to the floor. Forgetting all caution, Morgan dived at him, and Shane's legs bent, and he caught Morgan on his shoes and sent him flying back and against the bar with a crash that shook the whole length of it. Shane was up and leaping at Morgan as if there had been springs under him there on the floor. His left hand smacked at Morgan's forehead, pushing the head back, and his right fist drove straight into Morgan's throat. It made a sickening, dull sound, and Morgan went limp, sagging slowly to the floor. In the hush that followed Morgan's fall, Shane turned. He looked only at us, at Father and Mother and me, and it seemed to me that it hurt him to see us there. He breathed deeply, and now that he was still, you saw how battered and bloody he was. His shirt collar was dark and sodden. Blood was soaking into it, and this came only in part from the cut on his cheek. Unconsciously, he put up one hand to his head, and it came away smeared and sticky. He regarded it grimly and wiped it clean on his shirt. He swayed slightly, and when he started toward us, his feet dragged and he almost fell forward. One of the townsmen pushed out from the wall as though to help him. Shane pulled himself erect. His eyes blazed refusal. Straight and superb, not a tremor in him, he came to us. The one man in our valley, the one man I believe in all the world whose help he would take, was there and ready. Father stepped to meet him and put out a big arm reaching for his shoulders. He leaned against Father's arm, his body relaxing and his head dropping sideways. Father bent and picked him up. He went to the swinging doors, turning sideways to push them open. Mother took my hand, and we followed. She always knew when to talk and when not to talk, and she said no word while we watched Father lift Shane to the wagon seat. Mother and I perched on the back of the wagon, and we started home. In the kitchen, Mother set some water to heat on the stove and chased me to bed. Her back was barely to me after she tucked me in before I was peering around the door jamb. She got several clean rags, took the water from the stove, and went to work on Shane's head. It pained him plenty as the warm water soaked into the gash under the matted hair, and as she washed the clotted blood from his cheek. But it seemed to pain her more, for her hand shook at the worst moments, and she was the one who flinched. Father came in from unhitching the horses and sat by the stove, watching them. He pulled out his pipe and made very careful business of packing it and lighting it. Then it was his turn. "Get that shirt off, Joe. It's torn all down the back. We'll keep it just like it is, to remember tonight by. You were magnificent, Joe. And you, Shane, you were magnificent too." She was looking back and forth from one to the other and losing control of herself. "Did ever a woman have two such men?" And she turned from them and reached out blindly for a chair and sank into it and dropped her face in her hands, and the tears came. The two men stared at her, and then at each other, in that adult knowledge beyond my understanding. Shane rose, and he put a hand gently on Mother's head. Then, after a moment, he walked quietly out the door and into the night. Father drew on his pipe. It was out, and absently he lit it. He rose and went to the door and out on the porch. Gradually, Mother's sobs died down. She raised her head and wiped the tears away. "Joe?" He turned and started in. She stood up and stretched her hands toward him, and he was there and had her in his arms. "Do you think I don't know, Marion?" "But you don't. Not really. You can't. Because I don't know myself." "Don't fret yourself, Marion. I'm man enough to know it better when his trail meets mine. Whatever happens will be all right." "Oh, Joe. Joe, hold me tight and don't ever let go." What happened in our kitchen that night was beyond me in those days. But it didn't worry me because Father had said it would be all right. And how could anyone, knowing him, doubt that he would make it so? Fletcher, I heard from kids at school, was gone again. Yet Father and Shane were more wary than they had been before. They stayed even closer together, and they spent no more time than they had to in the fields. We didn't have to wait long. It was a week later, a Friday, when we were finishing supper, that Lou Johnson and Henry Shipstead brought us the news. Fletcher was back, and he had not come back alone. There was another man with him. Lou Johnson saw them as they got off the stage. This stranger was something of a dude about his clothes. And when he turned, the coat he wore, matching his pants, flapped open, and Johnson could see he was carrying 2 guns, big, capable .45s, in holsters hung fairly low and forward. Wilson was the man's name, Stark Wilson, and that was not all. He was a gunfighter said to be just as good with either hand and as fast on the draw as the best of them. He came to Cheyenne from Kansas. Shane shut off Johnson's story. "When did they hit town?" "Last night." "And you waited till now to tell it?" There was disgust in Shane's voice. "You're a farmer, all right, Johnson." He whirled on Father. "Quick, Joe. Which one has the hottest head? Which one's the easiest to prod into being a fool? Tory, is it, or Wright?" "Ernie Wright," Father said slowly. "Get moving, Johnson. Get out there and make it to Wright's in a hurry. Bring him here. Pick up Tory, too, but get Wright first." "He'll have to go into town for that," Henry Shipstead said heavily. "We passed them both down the road riding in." Shane jumped to his feet. He strode to the door, yanked it open, started out. He stopped, leaning forward and listening. "Hell, man," Henry Shipstead was grumbling. "What's your hurry?" All of us could hear it now. A horse, pounding up the road at full gallop. Shane turned back into the room. "There's your answer," he said bitterly. He swung the nearest chair to the wall and sat down. We heard the horse sliding to a stop out front. Frank Tory burst into the doorway. His chest heaved like he had been running as hard as the horse, and his voice was a whisper. "Ernie's shot! Fletcher's gunman, Wilson, killed him." The words jerked us to our feet, and we stood staring. All but Shane. He did not move. While Frank Torrey told the story, Jim Lewis, and a few minutes later, Ed Howells had come in. Bad news travels fast, and they were all in our kitchen now, and they were more shaken and sober than I had ever seen them. When Frank finished his story, Jim Lewis jumped up, almost shouting, "But damn it, Joe! That man can't just go around shooting people!" "Shut up, Jim," growled Henry Shipstead. "Don't you see the setup? Wilson badgered Ernie into getting himself in a spot where he had to go for his gun. Wilson could claim he shot in self-defense. He'll try the same thing on each of us." "But we've got to stop it. What chance have any of us got against Wilson? We're not gunmen. We're just a bunch of old cowhands and farmers. Call it anything you want. I call it murder." "You don't have to worry. Yet." Shane was up, and his face was hard with the rock ridges running along his jaw. "Fletcher won't bother with the likes of you now. He picked Ernie right to make the play plain. Now he'll head straight for the one real man in this valley. How quick he'll try you, Joe, depends on how he reads you. If he really knows you, he'll not wait more than a day or two to make sure you've had time to think it over. Then he'll grab the first chance to throw Wilson at you. He'll want it, like with Wright, in a public place where there'll be plenty of witnesses. You don't give him a chance, he'll try to make one." Father pulled on his pipe for a moment. "I reckon, boys, this will be a matter of waiting for the next few days." They were ready to leave it at that. They were ready to leave it to Father. They were decent men and good neighbors, but not one of them, were the decision his, would have stood up to Fletcher now. About noon the next day, we were just finishing dinner when we heard horses turning into our yard. I dashed to the window to peer out. It struck me strange that Shane, usually so alert, was not there ahead of me. Instead, he pushed back his chair and spoke gently, still sitting in it. "That'll be Fletcher, Joe. He knows he has to move fast. You take it easy. He's playing against time now, but he won't push anything here." Father nodded at Shane and went to the door. He lifted the rifle from the nails on the wall and stepped out on the porch. Shane followed quietly and leaned in the doorway, relaxed and watchful. There were 4 of them, Fletcher and Stark Wilson in the lead, 2 cowboys tagging. Stark Wilson was wearing no coat, and the 2 guns were swinging free. He was sure of himself, serene and deadly. Fletcher was smiling and affable. "Sorry to bother you, Starrett, so soon after that unfortunate affair last night. Shooting is so unnecessary in these things. If only people would show sense. But Wright never should have called Mr. Wilson here a liar. That was a mistake." "It was," Father said curtly. "But then Ernie always did believe in telling the truth." I could see Wilson stiffen and his lips tighten. Father did not look at him. "Speak your piece, Fletcher, and get off my land." "All right, Starrett. Here's my proposition. I like the way you do things. You and that man of yours are a combination I could use. I want you on my side of the fence. I'm getting rid of Morgan. I want you to take over as foreman. Since you've proved up on this place, I'll buy it from you. If you want to go on living here, that can be arranged. If you want to play around with that little herd of yours, that can be arranged too." "And the others?" Father said slowly. "Johnson, Shipstead, and the rest? And what about them?" "They'll have to go." Father did not hesitate. "No." Fletcher forced again that shrewd smile. "There's no percentage in being hasty, Starrett. I'll give you $1,000 for this place as it stands. But I'll not take an answer now. I'll give you till tonight to think it over. I'll be waiting at Grafton's store to hear you talk sense." He swung his horse and started away. The 2 cowboys turned to join him by the road. Wilson did not follow at once. He drove a sneering look at Father. "Yes, Starrett, think it over. You wouldn't like someone else to be enjoying this place of yours, and that woman there in the window." He was lifting his reins with one hand to pull his horse around, and suddenly he froze to attention. It must have been what he saw in Father's face. "Don't, Joe!" Shane was beside Father. He slipped past, moving smooth and steady down the steps. Wilson's right hand twitched and then was still as he saw that Shane carried no gun. Shane looked up at him, and his voice flicked in a whiplash of contempt. "You talk like a man because of that flashy hardware you're wearing. Strip it away and you'd shrivel down to boy size." The very daring of it held Wilson motionless for an instant, and Father's voice cut into it. "Shane, stop it!" The blackness faded from Wilson's face. He smiled grimly at Shane. "You do need someone to look after you." He whirled his horse and put it to a run to join Fletcher and the others in the road. It was only then that I realized that Mother was gripping my shoulders so hard they hurt. "He'd have drilled you, Joe, before you could have brought your gun up and pumped in a shell." "But, you crazy fool!" Father was covering his feelings with a show of exasperation. "You'd have made him plug you just so I'd have a chance to get him." Mother pushed me aside. "And both of you would have acted like fools just because he said that about me. I'll have you two know that if it's got to be done, I can take being insulted just as much as you can." "But, Marion," Father objected mildly, coming to her, "what better reason could a man have?" "Yes," said Shane gently. "What better reason?" He was looking at the two of them. I don't know how long they would have stood there on the porch in the warmth of that moment. I shattered it by asking, "Father, what are you going to tell Fletcher tonight?" There was no need for an answer. I knew what he would tell Fletcher. I knew, too, that because he was Father, he would go to Grafton's store and say it. And I understood why the breeze blowing in from the sun-washed fields was suddenly so chill and cheerless. They didn't say a word to each other, yet somehow I realized that they were closer together there in the stillness on the porch than they had ever been. They knew that Fletcher had caught Father in the one play that he could not avoid, because he would not avoid it. The silence bound them as no words ever could. Father sat on the top porch step. He took out his pipe and fixed his eyes on the horizon, on the mountains far across the river. Shane swung a chair to the house wall, and he too looked into the distance. Mother sat beside Father on the step. His hand covered hers, and the moments merged in the slow, dwindling procession of time. Loneliness gripped me. I wandered through the house, finding nothing there to do, and out to the barn. Everything that had happened before seemed far off, almost like another existence. All that mattered was the length of the shadows creeping across the yard as the sun drove down the afternoon sky. I went back to the front of the house and sat on the step below Father and Mother, between them, and their legs on each side of me made it seem better. I felt Father's hand on my head. "This is kind of tough on you, Bob." He was really talking to himself. "I can't see the full finish, but I can see this. Wilson down, and there'll be an end to it. Fletcher will be done. The town will see to that. I can't beat Wilson on the draw, but there's strength enough in this clumsy body of mine to keep me on my feet till I get him, too." Mother stirred and was still, and his voice went on. "Things could be worse. It helps a man to know that if anything happens to him, his family will be in better hands than his own." There was a sharp sound behind us on the porch. Shane had risen so swiftly that his chair had knocked against the wall. His hands were clenched tightly, and his face was pale with the effort shaking him. His eyes were tortured by thoughts that he could not escape. He strode to the steps, down past us and around the corner of the house. Mother was up and after him, running headlong. She stopped abruptly at the house corner, clutching at the wood. And then, slowly, she came back. She sank again on the step, close to Father, and he gathered her to him with one great arm. The silence spread. and the shadows touched the road and began to merge in the deeper shading that meant the sun was dipping below the mountains. Mother straightened, and as she stood up, Father rose too. He took hold of her 2 arms and held her in front of him. He smiled a strange little sad smile, and he loomed up there above me, the biggest man in all the world. "No supper for me now, Marion. A cup of your coffee is all I want." They passed through the doorway together. Where was Shane? I hurried toward the barn. I was almost to it when I saw him out by the pasture. He was staring over it and the grazing steers, at the great lonely mountains tipped with the gold of the sun now rushing down behind them. As I watched, he whirled and came back, striding with long, steady steps, his head held high. His face was quiet and untroubled, and little lights danced in his eyes. He went into the barn. I waited by the porch, watching the barn door. The minutes ticked past. Then he was coming swiftly toward me, and I stared and broke and ran into the house with the blood pounding in my head. "Father! Father, Shane's got his gun!" Father and Mother barely had time to look up from the table before he was framed in the doorway. He was dressed as he was that first day when he rode into our lives, in that dark and worn magnificence, from the black hat with its wide curling brim to the soft black boots. But what caught your eye was the single flash of white, the outer ivory plate on the grip of the gun, showing sharp and distinct against the dark material of the trousers. Slim and dark in the doorway, he seemed somehow to fill the whole frame. This was not our Shane, and yet it was. I remembered Ed Howells saying that this was the most dangerous man he had ever seen. I remembered in the same rush that Father had said he was the safest man we ever had in our house. I realized that both were right, and that this at last was Shane. "No, Shane, it won't do. Fletcher's making his play against me. It's my business." Father was looking fixedly at him. "There's where you're wrong, Joe," Shane said gently. "This is my business, my kind of business. I've had fun being a farmer. You've shown me new meaning in the word, and I'm proud that for a while maybe I qualified. But there are a few things a farmer can't handle." Father pushed up from the table. "Damn it, Shane, be sensible. Suppose you do put Wilson out of the way. That won't finish anything. They'd say I ducked, and they'd be right. No, I won't let you." "There's no man living can tell me what I can't do. Not even you, Joe. You forget there is still a way." He was talking to hold Father's attention. As he spoke, the gun was in his hand, and before Father could move, he swung it, swift and sharp, so the barrel lined flush along the side of Father's head, back of the temple, above the ear. Father folded. Shane's arm was under him, and he pivoted Father's loose body into his chair and eased it and the big shoulders forward till they rested on the table, face down. Shane stood erect and looked at Mother. She had not moved since he appeared in the doorway. The only light now was from the lamp swinging ever so slightly above them, circling them with its steady glow. They were alone in a moment that was all their own. Yet, when they spoke, it was of Father. "I was afraid that he'd take it that way. He couldn't do otherwise and be Joe Sterrett." "I know." "He'll come out maybe a little groggy, but all right. Tell him, Marion. Tell him no man need be ashamed of being beat by Shane." "I know," she said again. "I don't need to tell him. He knows too." Shane hesitated for a long, long moment. He was looking only at Mother, and she was all that he could see. Then, so quiet and easy, you were scarce aware that he was moving. He was gone into the outer darkness. Nothing could have kept me there that night. My mind held nothing but the driving desire to follow Shane. I waited until Mother turned to Father, bending over him. Then I slipped out to the porch. I went swiftly down the steps and into the freedom of the night. Shane was nowhere in sight. I stayed in the darker shadows, looking about, and at last I saw him emerging from the barn. The moon was rising low over the mountains, a clean, bright crescent. Its light was enough for me to see him plainly in outline. He was carrying his saddle, and a sudden pain stabbed through me as I saw that with it was his saddle roll. He went toward the pasture gate and gave his low whistle. The horse came out of the shadows at the far end, its hooves making no noise in the deep grass. Shane rose into the saddle, and the two shapes, the man and the horse, became one and moved down the road toward town. I started after him, running frantic in the middle of the road. Whether he heard me or not, he kept right on. I walked this way every school day, and it had never seemed so long before. At last, I could see Grafton's store ahead of me in the moonlight. Clumsy and tripping in my haste, I scrambled up the steps and hurried to my perch at the entrance to the saloon. The big room was crowded. Almost everyone who could be seen regularly around town was there. Everyone but our homestead neighbors. But something was wrong. The hum of activity, the whir of voices, was stilled in a hush more impressive than any noise could be. The attention of everyone in the room, like a single sense, was centered on a dark figure just inside the swinging doors. This was the Shane of the adventures I had dreamed for him, cool and competent, facing that room full of men in the simple solitude of his own invincible completeness. His eyes searched the room. They halted on a man sitting at a small table in the front corner. I recognized it was Stark Wilson. Shane's eyes swept on, checking off each person. They stopped again on a figure over by the wall, and the beginnings of a smile showed in them, and he nodded almost imperceptibly. It was Chris, tall and lanky, his arm in a sling, and as he caught Shane's nod, Chris flushed a little. Then over his face came a slow smile, warm and friendly. But Shane's eyes were already moving on. Then they jumped to Will Atkey, trying to make himself small behind the bar. "Where's Fletcher?" Will fumbled with the cloth in his hands. I don't know. He was here a while ago." Shane tilted his head slightly, so his eyes could clear his hat brim. He was scanning the balcony across the rear of the saloon. It was empty, and the doors there were closed. He stepped forward, disregarding the men by the bar, and walked quietly the length of the room. His eyes bored toward Red Marlin. "Where's Fletcher?" The silence was taut and unendurable. It had to break. The sound was that of Stark Wilson coming to his feet in the far front corner. His voice was lazy and insolent. "Where's Starrett?" While the words yet seemed to hang in the air, Shane was moving toward the front of the room. He stopped about 5 yards from Wilson. He cocked his head for one quick sidewise glance again at the balcony, and then he was looking only at Wilson. He didn't like the setup. Wilson had the front wall, and he was left in the open of the room. He understood the fact, assessed it, accepted it. They faced each other in the aisle, and the men along the bar jostled one another in their hurry to get to the opposite side of the room. "I had a few things to say to Fletcher," Shane said gently. "That can wait. You're a pushing man, Wilson, so I reckon I'd better accommodate you." Wilson's face sobered. "I've no quarrel with you, even if you are Starrett's man. Walk out of here without any fuss, I'll let you go. It's Starrett I want." "What you want, Wilson, and what you'll get are two different things. Your killing days are over." Wilson had it now. You could see him grasp the meaning. This quiet man was pushing him just as he had pushed Ernie Wright, and there was no escape. Time stopped, and there was nothing in the world but two men looking into eternity in each other's eyes. And then the room rocked in the sudden blur of action, indistinct in its incredible speed, and the roar of guns was a single sustained blast. And Shane stood, solid on his feet as a rooted oak, and Wilson swayed, his right arm hanging useless, blood beginning to show in a small stream from under the sleeve, the gun slipping from the numbed fingers. He backed against the wall, a bitter disbelief twisting his features. His left arm hooked, and the second gun was showing, and Shane's bullet smashed into his chest and his knees buckled, sliding him slowly down the wall, till the lifeless weight of the body toppled it sideways to the floor. "I gave him his chance," Shane murmured out of the depths of a great sadness. But the words had no meaning for me, because I noticed on the dark brown of his shirt, just above the belt to one side, a darker spot gradually widening. There was a stir in the air, and the room was coming to life, but it was cut short by the roar of a shot from the rear of the room. A wind seemed to whip Shane's shirt at the shoulder, and the glass of the front window beyond shattered. The others were turning to stare at the back of the room. My eyes were fixed on Shane, and I saw the whole man move, all of him, in the single flashing instant. I saw the head lead and the body swing and the driving power of the legs beneath. I saw the arm leap and the hand take the gun in the lightning sweep. I saw the barrel line up like a finger pointing, and the flames spurt even as the man himself was still in motion. And there, on the balcony, Fletcher, impaled in the act of aiming for a second shot, rocked on his heels and collapsed over the rail, jarring it loose and falling with it. Across the stunned and barren silence of the room, Shane's voice seemed to come from a great distance. "I expect that finishes it," he said. The stain on his shirt was bigger now, spreading fan-like above the belt. But he did not appear to know or care. He backed toward the swinging doors until his shoulders touched them. He faced that room of men and spoke to them in that gentle voice, with that quiet, inflexible quality. "I'll be riding on now, and there's not one of you that will follow." He turned his back on them, and the next moment the swinging doors were closing with a soft swish of sound. The room was crowded with action now. Men were clustering around the bodies of Wilson and Fletcher, pressing to the bar, talking excitedly. I didn't care what they were doing or saying. I had to get to Shane. I dashed out the door. He was on his horse, already starting away from the steps. "Shane! Oh, Shane!" He heard me and reined around, and I hurried up to him, standing by his stirrup and looking up. "Bobby boy, what are you doing here?" "I've been here all along. You've got to tell me, was Wilson—" He knew what was troubling me. He always knew. "Wilson," he said, "was mighty fast. As fast as I've ever seen." "I don't care," I said, the tears starting. "I don't care if he was the fastest that ever was. He'd never have been able to shoot you, would he? If you'd been in practice." He hesitated a moment. He gazed down at me and into me, and he knew what goes on in a boy's mind. Sure, Bob. He never even have cleared the holster." He started to bend down toward me, his hand reaching for my head, but the pain struck him like a whiplash, and his hand jumped to his shirt front. "Bob?" "Yes, Shane?" "A man is what he is, Bob. There's no breaking the mold. I tried that, and I've lost." But Shane, you—" "There's no going back from a killing, Bob. Right or wrong, the brand sticks. There's no going back. It's up to you now. Go home to your mother and father. Grow strong and straight. Take care of them, both of them. There's only one thing more I can do for them now." I felt the horse move away from me. He was riding away, and I knew that no word or thought could hold him. The big horse, patient and powerful, was already settling into the steady pace that had brought him into our valley. The ache in me was more than I could bear. Lost in my loneliness, I watched him go, out of town, far down the road where it curved out to the level country beyond our valley. A cloud passed over the moon, and he merged into the general shadow, and I couldn't see him. And the cloud passed on, and the road was a plain, thin ribbon to the horizon, and he was gone. I stumbled back to fall on the steps, my head in my arms to hide the tears. The voices of the men around me were meaningless noises in a bleak and empty world. It was Mr. Weir from the stage post who finally took me home. Father and Mother were in the kitchen, almost as I had left them. Mother had hitched her chair close to Father's. He was sitting up, his face tired and haggard, the ugly red mark standing out plain along the side of his head. They did not even scold me. Mother reached out and pulled me to her, and let me crawl into her lap, as I'd not done for 3 years or more. Father just stared at Mr. Weir. He couldn't trust himself to speak first. "Your troubles are over, Starrett." Father nodded. "You've come to tell me," he said wearily, "that he killed Stark Wilson before they got him. I know. He was Shane." "Wilson and Fletcher." Father started. "Fletcher, too? By Godfrey, yes, he would do it right. I can tell you, Weir, waiting here is the hardest job I ever had." Mr. Weir looked at the bruise along Father's head. "Listen, Starrett, there's not a man in town doesn't know you didn't stay here of your own will. And there's damn few that aren't glad it was Shane who came into the saloon tonight." "You should have seen him, Father. He was beautiful, Father. And Wilson wouldn't even have hit him if he'd been in practice. He told me so." "He told you?" The table was banging over as Father drove to his feet. He grabbed Mr. Weir by the coat front. "My God, man, why didn't you tell me? He's alive?" "Yes, he's alive, all right. Wilson got him, but no bullet can kill that man." Father was shaking him. "Where is he?" "He's gone. He's gone, alone and unfollowed as he wanted it. Out of the valley, and no one knows where." Father's hands dropped. He slumped again in his chair. New footsteps sounded on the porch, and a man pushed into our kitchen. It was Chris. His right arm was tight in the sling. In his left hand, he was carrying a bottle of red cherry soda pop. He came straight in and righted the table, and smacked the bottle on the top boards. He was embarrassed, and he was having trouble with his voice, but he spoke up. "I brought that for Bob. I'm a damn poor substitute, Starrett, but as soon as this arm's healed, I'm asking you to let me work for you." Father's face twisted, and his lips moved, but no words came. Mother was the one who said it. "Shane would like that, Chris." And still Father said nothing. Chris and Mr. Weir saw that nothing they could do or say would help at all. They turned and went out together. Mother and I sat there, watching Father. There was nothing we could do either. He glared at the walls as if they stifled him, and strode out the door into the yard. We heard his steps around the house and heading for the fields, and then we could hear nothing. I don't know how long we sat there. At last, Mother rose, still holding me in her arms. She carried me into my little room and helped me undress in the dim shadows of the moonlight through the window. She tucked me in and sat on the edge of the bed, and only then she whispered to me, "Now, Bob, tell me everything, just as you saw it happen." I told her, and when I was done, all she said in a soft little murmur was, "Thank you." She looked out the window and murmured the words again, but they were not for me. She was still looking out over the land to the great gray mountains when I fell asleep. She must have been there the whole night through, for it was the movement of her leaving that awakened me. I crept out of bed and peeked into the kitchen. She was standing in the open doorway. I fumbled into my clothes and went through the kitchen to her. She took my hand, and I clung to hers, and it was right that we should be together, and that together we should go find Father. We found him out by the corral, by the far end where Shane had added to it. The sun was beginning to rise through the cleft in the mountains across the river, with the fresh, reddish brilliance of early morning. Father's arms were folded on the top rail, his head bowed on them. When he turned to face us, his eyes were rimmed and tired.
"Marion, I'm sick of the sight of this valley and all that's in it. If I tried to stay here now, my heart wouldn't be in it. I know it's hard on you and the boy, but we'll have to pull up stakes and move on. Montana, maybe. I've heard there's good land for claiming up that way."
Mother had let go my hand, and she stood erect, so angry that her eyes snapped and her chin quivered. But she heard him through. Then her voice fairly crackled with emotion that was more than anger. "So, you'd run out on Shane just when he's really here to stay. But, Marion, you don't understand. He's gone." "He's not gone. He's here, in this place he gave us. He's all around us and in us, and he always will be." She ran to the tall corner post, one Shane had set. She beat at it with her hands. "Here, Joe, quick, pull it down." Father stared at her in amazement, but he did as she said. He took hold of the post and pulled at it. He shook his head and braced his feet and strained at it with all his strength. Creakings ran along the rails, and the post moved ever so slightly. But the rails held, and the post stood. Father turned from it, beads of sweat breaking on his face, a light creeping up his drawn cheeks. "See, Joe? See what I mean? We have roots here now that we can never tear loose." And then the morning was in Father's face, shining in his eyes, giving him new color and hope and understanding. For Mother was right. He was there. He was there in our place and in us. Whenever I needed him, he was there. I could close my eyes and he would be with me, and I would see him plain and hear again that gentle voice. He was the man who rode into our little valley out of the heart of the great glowing West, and when his work was done, rode back whence he had come. And he was Shane.